Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I nearly lost my mind watching that episode of Mountain Monsters back in 2014. I think that was the year. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I believe it was season 2, episode 6. The one that showed a team trapped in the wilderness by what they claimed was a pack of Sasquatch-like creatures stalking their campsite. Critics called it ridiculous, of course. But watching those recreated scenes of massive figures moving through the trees, those glowing eyes in the darkness, the team huddled around their fire wondering if they'd make it till morning. It hit a little too close to home. This is what happened to me and my crew on a construction site in eastern Oregon, November of 1992. I was working as an assistant supervisor for a mid-sized outfit that specialized in commercial data centers and tech facilities. We had landed a contract to build some sort of server farm for a major telecommunications company on the outskirts of a small mountain town. The location was ideal for the client's needs, right off the interstate, but far enough from residential areas they could run 24-hour operations without noise complaints. For us, though, the site would soon become a nightmare. The property sat adjacent to a national forest, which stretched for miles to the north and east. Our section had been clear-cut decades earlier and used briefly as grazing land before being abandoned. Nature had started to reclaim it, patchy woodland interspersed with open meadows of tall grass and wild brush. The client had purchased about 50 acres, but we were only developing the 20 acres closest to the highway. The rest would remain untouched as a buffer zone. We had been on the site for about 7 weeks when this event happened. The foundation was complete. We were in the middle of erecting the steel framework for the 150,000 square foot facility. November had brought shorter days and a biting chill to the air. Most days we wrapped up around 5:30 in the evening, but we'd fallen a bit behind schedule due to weather delays, and the client was pressing us to catch up. Our project manager, who we referred to as Ryder, had authorized overtime, keeping the crew on site until about 9:30 in the evening for the entire week. On November 12th, I arrived for my shift at noon, relieving the morning crew. The day passed by uneventfully. It was typical construction work with the usual headaches like materials being delivered to the wrong area, subcontractors arguing over workspace, all that nonsense. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, the sky was starting to darken. We switched on the portable floodlights that illuminated our immediate work area. Beyond their glare, the surrounding land quickly disappeared into blackness. Most of my crew were young guys in their 20s, except for our crane operator Harold. He was in his 50s and had worked construction almost his entire adult life. There were 14 of us on the site that night, a smaller crew than during the day, but enough to keep making progress on the structural elements. Around 7:45 in the evening, one of the younger workers, Jake, came to me with an odd look on his face. "Hey Ethan, there's something out there beyond the lights," he said. I thought he was messing with me, but his expression was dead serious. I followed him to the western edge of the site where he pointed into the darkness. "I keep seeing shapes moving in the distance, like animals watching us. But they're too big to be deer or elk," he explained. I stared out into that blackness, but I didn't really see anything. I reminded him that we had spotted a black bear on the property a couple of weeks back, and I told him to stay within the lighted area. I figured that was the end of it. Within the hour, 4 more workers had reported similar sightings. Dark shapes moving along the tree line, always at the periphery of visibility, always disappearing when looked at directly. I still hadn't seen anything myself, and I was starting to get a bit irritated, to be honest. This just seemed like a distraction to me. At about 8:20 in the evening, everything changed. The full moon had risen above the trees. Harold had stepped down from his crane to stretch his legs when he suddenly froze up, staring past the floodlights into the meadow about 150 yards away. "Holy hell," I heard him whisper. I followed his gaze, and I felt my blood turn to ice. In the moonlight, I could clearly see 4 large figures moving through the tall grass. They were massive things, covered in what looked like dark fur, moving around on all 4s, but there was something wrong with the way they moved. Not quite like any normal animal I'd ever seen. When one of them rose briefly into a bipedal stance to look in our direction, I heard Harold curse under his breath. "God, those aren't bears." Word spread quickly among the crew. Everyone stopped working just to watch the shapes prowling at the edge of the darkness. I called Ryder, who was back at the motel, but he thought we were pulling his leg and refused to come out. He ordered us to finish the schedule and to stop wasting time. Around 8:45 in the evening, we heard the first howls. These deep, throaty howls that seemed to contain elements of both wolf and human vocalizations. They came from multiple directions, suggesting there were more creatures surrounding us than the 4 we could currently see. The men began to argue about what we should do. Our vehicles were parked in a gravel lot, which was about 250 yards from the work site, in the opposite direction of the highway. To reach them, we'd have to cross an unlit stretch of ground, heading toward where we'd spotted at least 2 of the creatures. Harold wanted to call the police, but several guys pointed out we'd sound insane, reporting that we were encountering werewolves, or whatever these things were. Some said we should stay put until daylight. Others thought we should make a run for the vehicles while we still could. I tried my best to keep everyone calm. Everyone focused on finishing the critical welding work, so we could all leave together at 9:30 in the evening as we had planned. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as 9:30 approached. The shapes continued to patrol the perimeter, sometimes disappearing into the trees only to re-emerge elsewhere. None had entered the floodlit area though, which was a huge relief for all of us, I think. But they were definitely moving in a pattern that suggested they were watching us, assessing us. But why? At 9:15 in the evening, we began shutting down equipment, preparing to leave. That's when Tyler, one of our welders, let out a shout that made everyone spin around. Standing at the very edge of the light, no more than 40 feet from our primary generator, was one of those things. In the harsh floodlight, its features were more visible than I wanted them to be. It stood at about 8 feet tall. It had a muscular, hairy body that seemed like a hybrid of man and wolf. Its snout was long, filled with teeth that were clearly visible even at that distance, and its eyes reflected the light with a golden glow. The creature remained motionless, staring at us with what I can only describe as intelligence. Then it dropped to all fours and loped back into the dark. Panic nearly erupted then. 3 of the younger guys were ready to make a run for it, while others were grabbing tools as makeshift weapons. I managed to get everyone into the partly constructed server room, where we could safely talk without shouting over equipment noise. Listen to me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Those things have not come into the light. They could have rushed us already if they wanted to. I think they're territorial, not necessarily hunting us. They're between us and the cars, Ethan, Jake pointed out. How the heck are we going to get out of here? We debated some options. The creatures continued their patrol, occasionally visible in the moonlight, and occasionally announcing their presence with those chilling howls. By about 10 o'clock in the evening, we made a decision. We would stay together, keep the flood lights on, and wait. Maybe the creatures would lose interest, or maybe they would move away from the parking area. Quite a bit of time passed in tense silence. We took turns watching the perimeter while others tried to rest. None of us believed in werewolves, all right, not really, but we couldn't deny that we were seeing something very bizarre. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe these were escaped exotic animals. Maybe they were people in costumes trying to scare us. Maybe it was a mass hallucination brought on by exhaustion, or maybe something in the air from a nearby chemical plant. None of the explanations fit what we were witnessing. At 11:45 in the evening, we all jumped in unison when Harold's radio crackled on. It was Ryder, checking why the generator was still running when we should have been long gone by now. When Harold tried to explain what was happening, Ryder's response was predictably skeptical, but he seemed to sense some genuine fear in Harold's voice. He said he would drive out to meet us. We did our best to try to warn him away, telling him to just stay at his motel. But Ryder was stubborn and didn't believe in letting his crew face danger alone, even if he thought we were overreacting. 25 minutes later, we saw headlights approaching on the access road from the interstate. Ryder's pickup truck. The creatures noticed too. We watched in horror as 3 of them broke from the tree line and moved toward the approaching vehicle. We all expected the worst to happen. Ryder's truck slowed as the figures crossed the access road ahead of him, clearly visible in his headlights. The truck stopped completely for about 40 seconds, then suddenly accelerated forward, horn blaring continuously. The creatures scattered as Ryder roared into the construction site, sliding to a stop inside our ring of floodlights. He leapt out of the truck, face ashen. "What in the world are those things?" he shouted, all his skepticism gone. With Ryder's arrival, the dynamic shifted. We now had a vehicle inside our safe zone, but it wasn't about to hold all 14 of us. After a brief discussion, we developed a plan. Ryder would drive his truck toward the parking lot with the crew walking alongside, staying within the pool of light cast by his headlights and the portable work lights we could carry. We'd move as a tight group, make it to our vehicles, and get the heck out of there. At 12:30 in the morning, we put our plan into action. Ryder's truck moved very slowly, with men flanking it on all sides, each holding whatever tool or piece of equipment might serve as a weapon. Harold carried a portable floodlight powered by a battery pack, sweeping the light ahead of us. I walked at the rear of the group with a welding torch, watching our backs. We made it about halfway to the parking lot when I heard rustling in the tall grass just outside our circle of light. There was something pacing us. I called out a warning, and everyone bunched closer to the truck. Ryder stopped, and we formed a defensive circle, all facing outward. The rustling continued, circling us, joined by similar sounds from multiple directions. "Feels like they're hurting us," Harold muttered, "like we're prey animals." For a long, terrible moment, we stood frozen in place, listening to the creatures moving around us in the dark. Then, without warning, one of them darted through the edge of our light. Just a dark blur of movement, there, and gone too quickly to react. A demonstration, perhaps, of how easily they could reach us if they chose. Tyler panicked and broke formation, running ahead toward the distant parking lot before any of us could stop him. He was 30 yards away, then 50, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he ran. We shouted for him to come back, certain we were about to witness his death. But nothing attacked him, thankfully. He made it to about the halfway point to the parking lot unharmed, then slowed and stopped, realizing he was all alone in the dark. He just stood there, flashlight beams swinging from one direction to another in a panic. "Come back here," I called to him. "Don't run, take it slow." Tyler began walking back towards us, and then I saw it. A massive shape detached from the shadow of a pile of construction materials, moving on a parallel course to intercept Tyler. I yelled a warning. Tyler saw it too and froze. The creature stopped as well, watching him from only about 20 yards away. For an excruciating 40 seconds, man and beast remained motionless, locked in a standoff. Then, incredibly, the creature seemed to lose interest. It turned and loped away into the darkness. Tyler practically collapsed with relief, then resumed his careful return to our group. That strange encounter gave us all hope. Whatever these things were, while intimidating, they didn't seem intent on attacking us directly, at least for now. We resumed our slow procession toward the parking lot, maintaining our tight formation around Ryder's truck. 3 more times, we heard creatures rushing close, catching glimpses of those dark shapes just at the periphery of our light. But none of them breached our defensive circle. After what felt like ages, we reached the parking lot. The creatures remained visible at the edges of our light, watching as we quickly organized ourselves into cars. No one would be left alone. We started our vehicles simultaneously, forming a convoy with headlights blazing. As we pulled away from the construction site, I looked back through my rear window. In the glow of the still running floodlights, I could see at least 6 large shapes moving into the previously forbidden area, investigating where we had been working. They showed no interest in following us as we drove away. The next morning in daylight, Ryder and I returned to the site with a local sheriff's deputy. We found large, unusual footprints in the soft earth. These prints seemed to morph from wolf-like paws to something more humanoid. The deputy took photos, but was clearly skeptical of our story. He pointed out areas where the tall grass had been trampled by something large, forming paths that no deer or known predator would create. The deputy suggested a small pack of wolves, maybe mixed with feral dogs. His explanation didn't account for what we saw, though, and we didn't push him on it. The project continued with expanded security measures. We installed more lights, brought firearms, restricted work hours to daylight only. But nothing unusual happened for the remainder of the job, which we completed 4 months later. Most of the crew members never spoke of that night to outsiders. It became a sort of inside story, and when we discussed it together, we just referred to it as the night shift with knowing looks. Years later, watching that Mountain Monsters episode, I realized I'd never truly processed what we'd encountered. I guess I'd buried it, rationalized it, and tried to forget. But those recreated scenes of creatures stalking around a lonely property brought it all rushing back to the surface. The fear, the disbelief, the understanding that I came very close to being prey to something that I could not comprehend. I've never been able to look at a full moon the same way, and when they do come around, as they always do, a bit of dread fills me. A sensation that I can't fully explain. Those who weren't there with us, because they weren't the ones in a circle of failing light, hoping to survive the couple 100 yards to the parking lot. I've seen things my whole life that other people don't see. Growing up, there was a woman who walked the hallways of our house at night. No one else ever saw her, a tall figure in a white dress who would appear at the end of the corridor, watching. My parents blamed an overactive imagination, but I knew what I saw. By the time I got into construction, I'd learned to keep these experiences to myself. No one wants to work with the guy who believes in ghosts. So when I got assigned as foreman at Mountain View Estates, a lakeside property about 40 miles outside of Denver, I didn't mention my sensitivity to the paranormal. 36 luxury homes arranged in a crescent around a small natural lake. The developer called it exclusive living in harmony with nature. They had no idea what was waiting for us there. I'd been assigned to this project from the beginning. Site preparation started in early April, and we were looking at a 3-year timeline to complete all the homes. The developer wanted to create a sense of exclusivity, marketing the community as a retreat from city life with access to pristine nature. The lake was the crown jewel of the property, about 4 acres of clear water fed by an underground spring, surrounded by ancient pine trees the developer had fought to preserve. The marketing materials called it a serene oasis. In retrospect, maybe they should have checked the history of the place more thoroughly. The company I work for had landed the contract to build all 36 homes. It was a massive project that would keep us busy and profitable for at least 3 years. My crew was responsible for the first 8 houses on the southern edge of the lake. We just finished pouring foundations and were starting to frame when I first noticed something unusual. It was late May, about 9 weeks into the job. The weather had finally turned, with clear skies replacing the constant spring rain. I was on site until sunset that day, checking the lumber deliveries and making sure everything was ready for the next morning. As I was loading my tools into my truck, something caught my eye across the lake. A small figure sitting on one of the wooden benches the landscapers had installed the previous week. From my distance, maybe 1/3 of a mile across the water, it looked like a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Dark hair, wearing what appeared to be a red jacket and blue jeans. Nothing particularly strange about that, except that the property was fenced off and clearly marked as a construction zone. No one lived there yet, and the nearest existing homes were over 2 miles away. Plus, it was nearly 8:30 on a school night. I remember thinking it was odd, but not alarming. Probably a kid from one of the nearby ranches exploring the construction site. I even raised my hand to wave, but the figure remained motionless. I decided to drive around the lake to check on her, make sure she got home safely. It would have taken me about 12 minutes to circle the lake on the newly carved service road. When I pulled up to the bench, there was no one there. No footprints in the soft dirt surrounding it, no indication anyone had been sitting there just minutes before. I convinced myself I'd been mistaken, that the fading light and distance had played tricks on my vision. Maybe it had been a garbage bag left by one of the workers, or a shadow cast by the trees behind the bench. 3 days later, I saw her again. Same spot, same posture, same time of day as I was leaving. This time I grabbed my phone and took a picture, intending to show it to the security guard who patrolled the site at night. But when I looked at the photo, the bench was empty. I took 4 more in quick succession, but in each one the bench appeared unoccupied, despite the fact that I could clearly see a small figure sitting there with my naked eye. Over the next 3 weeks, the pattern continued. I'd see the girl on the bench almost every evening as I was leaving. Always in the same spot, always alone, always vanishing when I tried to approach or capture photographic evidence. None of the other workers mentioned seeing anything unusual, and I hesitated to bring it up. Construction sites attract a particular type of personality, and ghost stories aren't exactly welcome conversation among men who pride themselves on pragmatism and physical toughness. By mid-June, I tried telling myself that stress and long hours were messing with my head. We were scrambling to catch up after concrete delivery problems, and I'd been grinding through 14-hour days. I started leaving from the site before sunset, before that phantom child could materialize again. This escape plan worked for about a week, until the plumbing contractor screwed up some pipe work and forced me to stay late. As I was leaving, I kept my eyes locked on my truck, fighting the urge to look toward that bench. But something pulled my gaze there anyway, like a magnet. The girl sat there, rigid and unnatural, but this time she wasn't alone. A man stood beside the bench, his hand resting on its back. From that distance, I could make out a tall figure with dark hair, wearing what looked like a jacket that seemed wrong in the summer heat, as if it moved independently of any breeze. My skin prickled. Something about the man's posture seemed possessive, controlling. The way he stood behind the girl didn't look protective, it looked predatory. The hairs on my arms stood up as I watched them, these impossible figures that shouldn't exist. I started my truck with shaking hands and peeled out, taking the long way home to avoid passing anywhere near that bench. That weekend, I couldn't shake the image of that man standing over the girl. I drove to the site at dawn, checking every inch of fencing, searching for any way trespassers could slip in. I inspected the security system, reviewed camera footage, and tested the motion sensors myself. The place was locked down tight. Dense forest surrounded 3 sides, with a single gated road monitored 24/7. The security logs were clean except for wildlife triggers. No human could have entered without leaving evidence. I tracked down some old-timers at the local diner, fishing for information while pretending to discuss construction logistics. Several opposed our project, claiming we were disturbing things best left alone. When I pressed for specifics, they clammed up or changed the subject. One elderly rancher just shook his head and walked away when I mentioned seeing a man and child near the lake. I called a buddy who worked for the county records office. He owed me for helping with his garage renovation, so he dug around after hours. The property history was unremarkable. Ranch land until the 70s, then timber company land. But he found something odd. The surveyor's report from when the developers purchased the land noted an anomalous ground depression near the southeast shore that did not match natural geological formations. The developers had simply filled it in before construction. By early July, the sighting still sent ice through my veins each time. The girl and man would appear without warning. A blink and they'd be there, staring across the water. Sometimes she sat alone, small and vulnerable on that bench. Other times he hovered near her like a shadow. Each appearance left me drained with dread, my hands clammy on the steering wheel driving home. I'd given up trying to photograph them or approach. Whatever these apparitions were, they followed different laws than our world. Everything shifted on July 21st. I remember it was my nephew's birthday because his mother's calls and texts had been lighting up my phone all day, asking when I was coming to the party. A concrete mixer broke down mid-pour, leaving us scrambling until dark to finish before the mix hardened. My head pounded and my back ached as I finally headed to my truck, desperate to escape the sight and the phantoms that haunted it. My drive home took me around the west end of the lake and then south along a newly paved road that would eventually serve as the main entrance to the development. As I rounded the lake, I spotted the girl and man again, but this time they weren't at the bench. They were walking slowly along the shoreline path, heading south in the same direction I was driving. I slowed my truck, expecting them to vanish as they always did when I got too close, but they remained visible, solid, and substantial in the golden light of the setting sun. The girl was wearing what I could now see was a red windbreaker and dark blue jeans, clothes that seemed oddly new for a lakeside walk. The man wore a brown leather jacket that fell just below his waist, his black hair lifting slightly in the breeze. As I drew alongside them, I reduced my speed to barely 15 miles per hour, my curiosity finally overcoming my apprehension. They didn't acknowledge my presence, continuing their slow, deliberate pace along the path. I was close enough now to see their features clearly. The man appeared to be in his 40s, with a stern expression that wasn't quite angry, but certainly wasn't kind. The girl looked younger than I'd initially thought, maybe 7 or 8, with a fearful face that seemed too worried for her small frame. I drove past them, watching in my rearview mirror as they continued their walk. Then the girl's head snapped toward my truck with an unnatural quickness. Her eyes locked with mine in the mirror, and her lips moved. The words were unmistakable, "Help me." The man's grip tightened on her shoulder at that exact moment, his fingers digging in. His face twisted into something inhuman for just a split second, a flash of rage that wasn't just stern but malevolent. He wasn't protecting her, he was her captor. I slammed the brakes, tires skidding on loose gravel. When I looked back, the roadside was empty. They hadn't walked away or faded gradually. They'd simply blinked out of existence. I sat there, engine running, knuckles white on the steering wheel, stomach churning. The girl's desperate plea burned in my mind. This wasn't some lost soul wandering aimlessly. This was a child trapped by something sinister. The man wasn't her father. He was her jailer in death, as he must have been in life. I almost turned back to search for them, my nephew's birthday party forgotten. But what could I do? Chase ghosts across an empty construction site. And yet that plea kept echoing in my head, the terror in the girl's eyes, the man's possessive grip. She needed help from him, not just from being dead. I missed my nephew's party, Instead, I drove straight to a bar and downed whiskeys until the bartender cut me off. The alcohol didn't help. The girl's face haunted me through a sleepless night. The next morning, my head splitting, I called in sick. I couldn't face that lake, not yet. Instead, I pulled up property records on my laptop. Nothing useful there. Next, I called an ex-girlfriend who worked at the local news station. She owed me a favor after I rebuilt her deck last summer. I convinced her to let me access their digital archives after hours. That evening, I sat at her desk, searching through crime reports and old stories about the lake property while she finished editing the evening broadcast. It took most of the day, but I finally found something. A small article from September 1981, tucked away on page 9 of the local paper. A man named Robert Morris and his daughter Ashley had been reported missing after their car was found abandoned near what was then a logging road running alongside the lake. The article was brief, noting that the man's ex-wife had reported them missing when they failed to return from a weekend camping trip. Local police were investigating, but had few leads. I searched for follow-up articles, but found only one, dated 3 weeks later. The investigation had been transferred to the state police after local authorities exhausted their resources. There was no mention of the case being resolved, no reports of bodies found or the missing persons located alive. The ages fit. Robert Morris had been 42, his daughter 8. The timing was plausible. 42 years was well within the range of documented hauntings, if you believed in such things. And the location was exact. The abandoned car had been found precisely where the development's main entrance road now ran. What didn't fit was my role in all this. Why would these spirits, if that's what they were, reveal themselves to me? Why would the girl ask me for help? I had no connection to the case, no special skills or knowledge that might resolve whatever had happened to them. I returned to work the next day, unable to share my discoveries with anyone for fear of ridicule or worse. The sightings continued through the summer, but something had changed. The girl and man appeared more frequently now, and not always at sunset. Sometimes I'd glimpse them during my lunch break, or while inspecting work on the far side of the lake. They never approached the active construction areas, always maintaining their distance, always vanishing if I or anyone else came too near. But the girl continued to look at me whenever our paths crossed, her eyes finding mine across the water or through the trees. I never saw her mouth words again, but I felt the weight of her gaze, the expectation in her silent observation. In late August, the developer organized a media event to showcase the progress on the first few homes. Local news outlets sent reporters, and the mayor made an appearance, praising the project for bringing jobs and tax revenue to the area. During the event, I watched as a photographer positioned the developer and various officials on the shoreline for a publicity shot. The lake and partially constructed homes forming a picturesque backdrop. When the photos appeared in the local paper the next day, I wasn't surprised to see that the girl and man, who had been clearly visible to me standing at the water's edge during the shoot, were absent from the images. By September, the first 8 homes were nearing completion. The framing was done, roofs were on, and interior work was progressing on schedule. We'd broken ground on the next phase of houses, and the development was taking shape just as the architectural renderings had promised. The lake remained the centerpiece, its waters reflecting the new structures rising around it. The bench where I'd first seen the girl had been replaced with a more elaborate seating area, part of a community gathering space that would eventually include a small dock and pavilion. I wondered if the changes to the landscape would affect the hauntings, if the spirits were somehow tied to specific features of the land that were now being altered or removed. They weren't. If anything, the girl and man became more visible as the summer progressed into fall. Other workers began to notice them too, though no one spoke openly about what they were seeing. I'd catch someone staring across the lake, their work temporarily forgotten, their expression a mixture of confusion and unease. When they realized I was watching, they'd quickly return to their tasks, avoiding eye contact or conversation. In October, I made a decision. I contacted the state police and inquired about the Morris case. The officer I spoke with was initially confused. The case was decades old and long since classified as cold. But when I mentioned I was working at a construction site near where the car had been found, his tone changed. He asked me to come to the station. The detective assigned to cold cases was a man in his 50s named Lieutenant Rodriguez. He listened patiently as I described finding the newspaper articles. I didn't mention the ghostly sightings, focusing instead on my curiosity about an unsolved disappearance connected to the property where I was working. Rodriguez pulled the case file, thin and yellowed with age. The investigation had stalled almost immediately, he explained. Robert Morris's ex-wife, Jennifer, had been the primary suspect. Custody disappearances almost always involved the non-custodial parent, but there had been no evidence to support an arrest. No blood in the car or at Robert's apartment, no history of threats or violence, no life insurance policies or other financial motives. Jennifer Morris had an alibi for the weekend they vanished, verified by multiple coworkers at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. The case had gone cold within months. Jennifer Morris had moved away the following year, eventually remarrying and relocating to California. She died in 2009, never knowing what had happened to her ex-husband and daughter. I asked if the lake had ever been searched. Rodriguez confirmed it had been multiple times over the years. Nothing had ever been found. He seemed to be studying me carefully, perhaps wondering why a construction foreman was so interested in a 42-year-old missing persons case. I thanked him for his time and left, no closer to understanding what I was experiencing at the lake. November brought heavy rains that delayed our work and transformed the site into a muddy mess. The lake level rose significantly, flooding parts of the newly landscaped shoreline and threatening the foundations of the homes nearest the water. The developer brought in environmental engineers to assess the situation, and they recommended installing additional drainage systems to manage the unexpected water volume. The excavation for these drainage systems began in late November, focusing on the southeastern shore where the flooding was most severe. 4 days into this work, one of the backhoe operators radioed me in a panic. They'd uncovered something in the soil, about 7 feet below the original ground level. I arrived to find him standing pale-faced beside his machine. In the freshly turned earth lay the unmistakable shape of a car, its once metallic surface now reduced to rust and corrosion after decades underground. Even before the forensic team confirmed it hours later, I knew we'd found Robert Morris's missing vehicle, buried deep in what had once been a marshy area of shoreline, but was now solid ground due to decades of natural silting and deliberate landfill by previous property owners. The recovery took a week. The car had been deliberately buried under layers of soil and rocks, hidden from previous searches. Inside were two bodies, a man and a girl, but the forensic report revealed something chilling. The man wasn't Robert Morris. He was identified as David Crane, Jennifer's boyfriend at the time. DNA confirmed the girl was Ashley Morris. The truth emerged in fragments. Robert Morris hadn't just discovered Jennifer's relationship with David. He had threatened to take Ashley away permanently, to disappear where Jennifer could never find them. The plan had been for David to intercept Robert and Ashley during their camping trip, to bring Ashley back to Jennifer. But something went wrong. The struggle escalated beyond what David had intended. The police found David's journal hidden in the car's spare tire well, somehow preserved in a waterproof bag. The final entry described Ashley witnessing something she shouldn't have and threatening to tell everyone what Uncle David did to Daddy. David wrote that the girl couldn't be trusted anymore, and he needed to fix the situation. Robert's body was never found. Construction at Mountain View Estates was halted for nearly 4 months during the investigation and subsequent media frenzy. The developer considered abandoning the project entirely, fearing the property would be forever tainted by its association with the murders. But by March, work had resumed, albeit with a more subdued marketing approach that emphasized the natural beauty of the area rather than its peaceful seclusion. I still work at the site, overseeing the completion of homes that will soon be occupied by families unaware or unconcerned about the tragedy that occurred there decades ago. The lake remains the centerpiece of the development, its waters calm and reflective on clear days. The girl and man no longer appear on its shores. Whatever kept them bound to this place seems to have been resolved by the discovery of their bodies and the revelation of the truth about their deaths. Sometimes I find myself looking for them out of habit, scanning the shoreline or the bench where I first saw the girl sitting alone. But the only figures I see now are construction workers, landscapers, and occasionally prospective home buyers touring the property. You ever think about whether you've possibly run across a serial killer without even knowing it? They're not so common these days, modern stats would have you believe, but I think it still happens, because I believe it happened to me. We were building an expansion to the local state university, big project, 4 stories with 3 wings connecting to the main library building. The frame was about halfway done when this guy started to show up. He just appeared one day in April, tall, really thin guy wearing a gray suit jacket that was way too formal for a construction site. He always carried this black leather portfolio, the kind architects use for drawings. He'd walk around the site perimeter, taking notes in a small red notebook. One of our guys asked if he was a building inspector. I had no clue. Nobody told us about any inspection scheduled. The weird part was he never wore a hard hat, never checked in at the site office either, and he never talked to any of us. Instead, he seemed to just watch. One of the newer guys, Robert, was suspicious too. "That guy doesn't look at the building," he said during lunch one day. "He looks at us." I told Robert to leave it alone, but the next day I saw him walk up to the guy near the south entrance. I was working on the second floor, couldn't hear what they said, but I saw Robert trying to be friendly. The tall man just smiled, not a normal smile at all, then turned and walked away. Later on, Robert told me he didn't say a word. Just stared at me like he was memorizing my face, he said. The tall man didn't show up for a couple of days after that. Then Robert started to miss work, didn't even call in. That wasn't like him. When he missed a second day, we called his emergency contact, which was his roommate. The roommate called back that evening in tears. Robert was dead. Someone had stabbed him multiple times in his apartment. I was called to Robert's apartment to identify some of his stuff. What I saw there still keeps me up at night. The walls were covered with drawings, not professional ones. Hand-drawn sketches of the university library mixed with floor plans of houses. Our houses. My kitchen window was drawn perfectly, even showing the small crack in the glass I hadn't gotten around to fixing. A detective showed me some security footage from the site. The tall man was careful to avoid most cameras, but one caught him looking right at it, with that same empty smile Robert had mentioned. The detective explained he was a former student at this same university, had some kind of breakdown after his sister died during a medical procedure at the campus health center. Blamed the doctors, the university, everything. When I asked why he had targeted one of my workers, the detective replied, "You're expanding the place where he lost everything." In his mind, I think you're helping them kill more people. They found detailed plans in Robert's apartment, showing how the man was going to sabotage critical support beams in the building so that it would eventually collapse after opening. I wonder if Robert had interrupted what he was doing that day, and he wasn't happy about that. There was a massive manhunt for weeks afterward. Construction was halted and eventually started again with police guards. We checked and rechecked everything during the build. Didn't find any tampering, thankfully. Never found the tall man either. Since then, I've heard stories from 4 other construction sites in the area. Workers talking about seeing a tall guy with a portfolio hanging around at dusk. Last month, a carpenter from another university building project didn't show up for work. They found drawings in his garage, not of the building he was working on, but of the next academic facility planned for the campus. The cops never officially connected these cases. The detective who handled Robert's murder retired, and new officers don't seem too concerned about the architect of death. But we are. Every construction crew warns each other. If you see him watching, you're already in danger. I've installed security cameras and motion sensors at my house. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear someone outside. The worst part is nobody believes there's a connection, except those of us who have seen him. He leaves no evidence except those detailed drawings and the dead who are found. I keep track of every rumored sighting and every unexplained disappearance in construction around here. There's definitely a pattern, but it's too spread out for the authorities to truly care. He's still out there, watching from the shadows of half-built buildings, studying us like blueprints, planning his next move. And we keep building, never knowing when we might catch his attention, never knowing when our names might end up sketched in someone's garage. I was a fresh-faced graduate from high school, the summer before I left for Michigan State. I took a job at the Ford assembly plant in Dearborn. I had a full scholarship for my first 2 years, but having a full wallet would help pay for the small things. Most of the guys were friendly and entertaining. A day didn't pass where we weren't doubled over in laughter because of something someone did or said. Two of the guys were exceptionally funny. Jason and Tyler had been working on separate lines or together for the past 15 years. They were both great at practical jokers, but sometimes Jason would take things a little too far. Tyler was more than often the target of his humor. This would become a source of tension between the two, but they always made up by the end of the shift. As you may expect, eventually Jason's joking would go too far for Tyler to overlook. That day just happened to be on my final week on the job. For some time, everyone on the floor had noticed Tyler wasn't himself. He spent long periods of time somewhere talking on his phone. When he wasn't gone, he seemed constantly agitated. His usual happy-go-lucky manner had disappeared. We'd all tried our best to make him laugh, but nothing had worked. Not even Jason could do it. As time went on, we all began to believe his troubles were about his girlfriend. When Jason heard about this, he couldn't stop himself from poking at the sore spot. On this day, Tyler had gone on another phone call, and when he came back, Jason started joking around. "What's wrong, Tyler boy? Are you having troubles at home? Is your old lady getting some action from the mailman?" The verbal jabs only served to annoy Tyler even further. He said nothing. Instead, he just stared at Jason like he was gonna burn through him with his eyes. Jason wasn't going to let his bad news get in the way of getting a laugh. After lunch and throughout the rest of the shift, Jason continued on with his jokes. Tyler, a guy who usually said something when he was fed up, held his tongue the whole day. I knew if he didn't put a stop to Jason's poking, he would take things too far and cause a problem. Maybe even a fight. I thought Tyler was clearly not in any mood to let the remarks roll off his back, and as quitting time arrived, I relaxed. I was almost sure Jason would let up. Unfortunately, things only got worse. A lot worse. It was quitting time. We were going around the station, collecting our tools and cleaning any mess we left behind. Everyone was focused on the task at hand. I was off in my own little world, thinking about any last-minute things I needed to do before I left for school. When everything was complete, we were all standing around discussing our plans for the forthcoming weekend. It had been a while since Jason had made any jokes, and I assumed he'd stop for the day. When his turn came, he looked very serious and said, "Well, I think since old Tyler's going fishing this weekend, I'll go over to his place and give his old lady some loving." The joke had come by complete surprise to all of us, and we all fell over ourselves laughing. All but Tyler, of course. I saw a snarl appear across his face. His teeth were gritted so tightly it looked like they'd crumble any second. "I'm so sick of your stupid jokes." No sooner had he said this, Tyler stepped forward, his wrench drawn back. I was precariously close to Jason at the time. I stumbled back so quickly I fell onto my butt. I looked up just as Tyler brought the heavy end of the wrench into Jason's skull. Jason immediately fell over, seizing, writhing around the floor. I was in shock and I froze where I was. I watched Tyler for his next move. He stood over Jason's convulsing body for a moment, surveying his handiwork, I suppose. I was relieved when he calmly walked over to a workbench and just sat down. I don't think I could have moved had he come at me. Just like me, the other guys were frozen in place, watching as Jason's body slowly came to a limp halt. We all looked at each other, too terrified to speak. Tyler broke the silence for us. I guess you all should call the cops. I'm not gonna run off or anything. I'm just so fed up." The resignation in his voice showed just how far gone he was. The old Tyler I knew wouldn't have done anything like this. We did like he asked, and he didn't give the cops any trouble when it came time to take him away. I thought the shock was affecting me at that moment, but even now, I don't feel anything but sorry for Tyler. It would come out later just how bad things had been going on at home. His girlfriend at the time had cheated on him more than once. She had blamed it all on him, said he'd been working too much. Sometimes 3 jobs just to keep her happy and keep up with expenses. He was neck deep in love and too blind to realize what was happening until it already had happened. After all he did to give her what she wanted, she had the nerve to complain about him being gone so much. When he was at work, all he could think about was, is she with another guy right now? He was too private to share any of this with us. I don't think Jason had any idea what was truly occurring. He took a shot, and when he saw that he'd hit a nerve, he rode it into the ground. And he did that a lot. And I suppose this turned out to be one too many. I'm sometimes still in shock when I sit back and think about how quickly his life left his body. Even in those last few convulsing moments. All of us offered to serve as character witnesses, but it turned out not to be necessary. A deal was struck, and Tyler agreed to serve 15 years. He's been offered parole in the intervening years, but declined it. With his release date soon approaching, I hope he's able to get his life back together and move beyond the shadow of this crime of passion. I suppose you could say I've saved the most important person in the story for last. Jason's story obviously ended on that factory floor. Some readers may wonder why Tyler had received so much sympathy and Jason so little. Well, the truth is, although he was a really funny guy, that was about all he had going for him. I said already how far he would push Tyler with his joking. Heck, some folks may call it bullying these days, and I'd say they'd be right. He didn't do that to just Tyler. Not one of us escaped his comedic jabs, and that was far from his worst trait though. Even around a bunch of Detroit factory workers, Jason's racism was off-putting. Like with his jokes, not a single culture was off-limits, and he wasn't afraid to say it. I won't even get into his views on women. I'll just sum it up by saying Jason was not a good person. Funny people tend to get away with things other folks can't. However, even when you're making people laugh, there's a line. And unfortunately for Jason, he crossed it one time too many. I probably don't have to tell you that kids aren't always the kindest of people. When you're growing up, you are learning right and wrong in real time. Kids often do and say things grown-ups would scoff at. Some things you could call cruel, and none of us reached adulthood without being guilty of these misdemeanors. Not even me. Some may reach the end of this story and find me guilty of being one of the worst, and I'm willing to suffer that fate. I may even agree with you. After all, when I was 12, I helped kill a man. Once I reached the age of 14, I passed into the world of latchkey kid, a phenomenon I'm not even sure exists anymore. However, for a few years prior to that, I was forced to spend my time out of school at a local large-scale summer camp. I know my folks had no other choice at the time, but the experience was bristling, especially in the summers. I'd been free to run unattended since birth. I still don't look back favorably on that time, and my feelings about being stuck in summer camp is another story for another time. You're here to hear about my crime. Well, during the summers, the camp had to find a way to keep hundreds of kids, some almost as old as 16, busy. Since the center happened to be located near the downtown area of our small Ohio town, they used this to their advantage. Several attractions were within walking distance. The most often visited, and my favorite, was the city library. At least once a month, we'd be grouped together and march the quarter of a mile or so to the place. On the walk there, the group would pass places like the old post office and several large churches. One of these had a water tower that was easily 50 to 75 feet in the air. I'm not sure the exact height, but to a child's eyes, it might as well have been 1,000 feet. Suffice to say, you wouldn't want to fall from the top of it. One particular day, our group was marching to the library and had stopped across from the water tower. Someone had noticed a man working at the very top of it. I couldn't tell you what he was doing, but to us, he was a prime target for our harassment. I have no idea who said it first, but once the initial call for fall down was heard, most of the other boys joined in. It's not a thing I say with any pride, but it's what happened. The ghoulish chant went on for another few seconds until our counselor told us to shut up. Unfortunately, her demands came too late. No more had the yell ceased than a snapping was heard. The snapping was quickly followed by the horrible sight of the falling man. Everyone had seen it happen. Fortunately, his body landed on the opposite side of the structure, and our young eyes were prevented from seeing his ultimate demise. As you can guess, the incident caused quite a stir. Several of the girls began screaming and crying. I was in total shock for my part. The counselor did all she could do and rushed us back to the camp. I don't recall much discussion upon our return. The girls were comforted, and us boys, we may have mumbled a bit about it to our friends, but no one seemed to want to relive it. These days, I'm sure droves of psychologists and counselors would have been called in to make us talk about it incessantly. This was the 90s, though. People dealt with trauma in much different ways. Whether you agree or not, that was the way things were. Around the center, the incident was quickly forgotten, although a kid would bring it up from time to time. Most of us, especially those who witnessed it, just wanted to forget. I still have no idea if my parents were notified about it. The last thing I wanted to do was bring it up to them. I like to act as if terrible things never happened, and it's worked for me so far. And let's hope it continues to. The poor man who died that day, I have no idea what unfolded afterwards. I assumed that he was some sort of maintenance worker. Looking back, seeing that he was on some type of scaffolding at the time, he was probably just doing some basic repairs. The adults shielded us from any severe details beyond that, and I can't say I blame them. I tried to find as much information in the intervening years, but didn't find much. It's probably for the best. I'm sure his loved ones don't want to remember him by his manner of death. This may be the first time I've actually mentioned it to anybody who wasn't there that day. I'm sure you're wondering the same thing I am. Did our yelling actually cause that poor man's death? That question will never be answered. I remember the sound of a snapping rope, but that may be a coping mechanism. It's probably our jeering that caused him to become distracted and led to his horrible fall. A mistake in sight. I like to think that he never even heard us, and circumstances were what they were. Does that remove that last bit of nagging doubt from my mind? I'll let you figure that last one out for yourself. I know I'm not the only person to suffer from the financial collapse of 2008. It was far from a 1929 crash, but it did plenty of damage nonetheless. I'd been working in the automotive finance sector for almost 15 years when it happened. Once it became clear that there were going to be a lot of changes in the regulations, I was one of the first in my company to be let go. I don't blame the bosses. In a time so beset with uncertainty, a corporation's finances should be a primary consideration. I figured finding a job wouldn't take long. Week after week, I sent out resumes and contacted friends in the industry. I kept getting the same answer. Sorry, we can't take on new people until we know where things are headed. It wasn't the reply I was hoping for, but I understood. After a few months passed, I realized I was going to have to find a new line of work. I took a chance and called an old boss I'd had in college. Just after high school and all through college, I'd supported myself in the building trades. It had been a long time, and I wasn't even sure if he'd remember me. He told me if I ever needed a job, he'd hire me back. The gamble paid off. He did remember me and promised to keep me on as long as I needed the work. It came just in time, too. Although my wife and I were still renting, I knew she had her heart set on buying her own place. Oh yeah, we also had a child on the way, so I guess you can see the urgency. It took a few weeks to get the hang of things again. The industry had evolved greatly in the time I'd been away, but I eventually caught up. Things were going well until the morning myself and another guy were sent to repair the siding of a huge 3-story house in a historic district of Cleveland. A massive renovation was underway, and the painters couldn't start working on the outside until we finished our part. The scaffolding was already up when we arrived. I could tell from my first step the thing was thrown together fast. I gave it a quick shake and nothing fell off, so I gave it a pass. I'd been on some rickety setups before, and this was solid by comparison. There was no time to be timid. We were on the clock, and it had to be done yesterday. I ignored my concerns, and we got to work. We started at the very top, and had been there about 20 minutes when everything went to chaos. First came a high-pitched ping, followed by 2 quick snaps. As I looked to my left, I watched my coworker drop the roughly 40 feet to earth. As he fell, planks of wood and poles fell upon him. It all seemed to go in slow motion from then on, and I knew that I was next. For some stupid reason, I reached out and tried to grab the siding before me. I watched long scratches appear on the cedar as the scaffolding dropped below. I tensed up and prepared for my landing. When it did finally come, I believe that I lost consciousness for a few seconds. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck, and I can only imagine the other guy felt even worse. The whole rig, including myself, ended up crashing down upon him. We'd been taken away in separate ambulances, and understandably, I was focused on my own condition. My back turned out to be the worst of my injuries. I'll be brief and just say it had been broken in several places and very badly. If you think I got off the worst, you'd be dead wrong. My coworker had major internal injuries to go along with his broken bones. While both of us would spend another week in the hospital, I'm of the opinion he will suffer the most in the long term. Our boss had been there along with our families the whole time. He'd made it crystal clear that everything would be handled by him. It was a relief to hear, but the least he could do. The oddest part to that week was the near panic he was in. This is a man who'd seen it all. He'd fought in Vietnam, neck deep in some of the heaviest fighting. Nothing would ever shake him. Once, he watched a guy shoot himself in the hand with a pneumatic nail gun and didn't even blink. Almost every time I saw him that week, he came across more shaken than even my wife, and believe me, my wife was a blubbering mess. I assumed he was overly upset because he'd known me for so long. Only later did the whole truth come out. I just happened to be speaking with my injured coworker, and he revealed a very important detail. The topic of suing our boss came up. I had no reason to file suit against the man. He'd been a good friend and boss for many years, not to mention he'd taken care of anything we'd needed. My coworker brought up something I'd never even considered. Who would set up the scaffold? I was the one who decided to climb the junky thing, after all. I wasn't looking to blame anyone, and it turned out that he had spoken to one of the men responsible just days prior. The guy said that scaffolding had been missing several bolts. When he offered to go back to the warehouse and get some to replace them, our boss blew him off. In fact, he looked at the thing and said, "It's fine. We don't have the time to worry about a few screws. I've seen worse before." Everything the way he'd been acting. His insistence on paying for everything before it had even been mentioned. It all made so much more sense. It had been 4 years since the accident, and I was getting disability checks from the government. While not a lot of money, our family was able to get by. Had I known he'd been so negligent back then, both of us could have sued him into bankruptcy. And that was exactly why he was so panicked. He knew he'd screwed up, and big time. The revelation hurt me more than angered me. Some friend. He knew I would be on that scaffold. Just to save a little time and make a little more money, he neglected his workers' safety. In light of this information, I cut ties with the man. My life has been changed, definitely for the worse, because of his carelessness. Just thinking of him in this moment makes me sick to my stomach. While I wouldn't call it an opportunity, I did find a place online where I can complete my education and get my accounting degree. Darn near 30 years ago, I'd been a hair away from getting it, but I took the automotive financing job. The money was too good to turn down, and when you're young, we don't tend to think about things in the long term. I'm able to take in work from home, and the extra income has been a blessing. This past year, I was finally able to make my wife's dream come true and buy her first home. My only regret is that I'm too busted up to carry her across the threshold. All this happened because of the negligence of one man, a man I once called a friend. I'll open up with a small bit of backstory. When I was 15 years old, my dad was transferred to a small city in Arizona. It boasted a grand total of 15,000 citizens, and I'll bet not one had ever left the place. While I have grown to see the beauty of the area, a small place like that for a teenager was like waking up in a bad dream. Even before my first semester of college had begun, I was packing everything I could fit into my car and heading back across the country. It didn't take long for my old man to befriend one of our neighbors. He and Robert had both been vintage baseball card collectors when they were younger, and this new friendship had rekindled a love for the hobby in both of them. Until Robert's recent passing, the two spent most of their free time trading cards and discussing statistics. The subject of baseball memorabilia brings us to the point of the story. At some point in the early 90s, Robert was having trouble with his air conditioning unit. The system wasn't cooling properly, and the repair costs were getting expensive. Most of the ductwork was running through the crawl space beneath his house, down into his home office. He crawled inch by inch through the crawl space until he discovered his problem. It appeared that a small animal had been chewing on the insulation around the ducts, and Robert was livid. This variety of repair wasn't cheap. In order to prevent any future problems, he meticulously tracked down any small hole or crack in the foundation of his house and sealed them up tight. As he hoped, no further problems were had. He and my dad continued sharing their interest for the hobby until Robert's death in 2016. Upon his passing, Robert's home had been left to his son. He decided to put it up on the market, and before he could, a few repairs had to be done. He found a couple of companies able to do the work and agreed on a price. He set them to their job and waited. Within a few days, he'd received a call from one of these contractors with a shocking story. While undertaking the demolition of the back deck, they had discovered a square piece of plywood nailed to the house. Their curiosity took over, and they pried it from the foundation. The board had been covering an opening to the crawl space that led under the old house. These are common on older houses without basements. When they flashed their lights under the house, they were horrified to discover the mummified body of a human. Of course, they called the cops right away, and naturally, the authorities had some questions for him. He was just as baffled as they were. The corpse had to have been there for many years, which meant the only person who may have known the truth was dead too. An in-depth investigation was launched, and after one more discussion with Robert's son, a final theory was formed. This theory would mean the unfortunate victim suffered a prolonged and miserable death not many could even imagine in their darkest of nightmares. During a second discussion, one of the detectives asked Robert's son to think back on that time, to recall any strange event, no matter how insignificant. Although difficult at first, something was triggered in his mind, a small but important piece of the puzzle. It was mere days after Robert had undertaken his exhaustive sealing up of his home. He and his then teenage son had left for a long-awaited trip to the Grand Canyon. A week later, they returned home to a foul smell seeping in from their back porch. Robert had attributed it to a dead squirrel or rat, perhaps trapped there after the sealing up. When his son asked what he planned to do about the stench, Robert said, "Nothing. I'm not crawling back under there. It'll fade away eventually, and we don't use that rickety old porch anyways. Forget about it." And they did just that. Neither man would ever open that door again, and the smell would fade away just as Robert had predicted. This last little fact was all the detectives needed. From what they could tell, the victim had been living in the crawl space for some time. Once Robert had sealed his exit shut, his unknown tenant was doomed. With no one around to hear his pleas for help, he quickly succumbed to dehydration. A truly horrible way to die for any man, and perhaps it was better that Robert wasn't around for the ghoulish discovery. The guilt, surely, would have been overwhelming. Despite the large amount of press surrounding the death, Robert's son was eventually able to sell the house and disappear quickly back into anonymity. I've heard some crazy things during my time in the trade. The following is a recounting of the most terrible and heartbreaking thing I'd ever encountered with my own eyes. This took place in 2017. I'd only been apprenticing as a road construction worker for a few years. Our company had just won a big contract from the state. The job was to rebuild a major stretch of Interstate 75 that ran through downtown Atlanta. The old asphalt was cracking and buckling, and the whole section needed to be torn up and repaved. My job didn't begin until all the demolition was completed and the area cleared. With nothing better to do, I drove out to the site to watch the tearing up and prepping of the roadway. For most of the day, my supervisor and I hung around and talked with the guys doing the work. I'd become good friends with several of the dudes working with me. A group of us would go out on Saturday nights to drink and have a good time. David, a black fellow about my age, turned out to have grown up not 2 blocks from me. For some reason, we'd never met before I got on at the company. The two of us would share stories of our childhood in the old neighborhood, and we soon became good friends. Just a few weeks prior to this incident, he and his girl had asked me to move into their apartment. Their prior roommate had lost his job and had to move back home. I agreed and was in the process of packing up when this happened. Anyway, my supervisor and I returned after lunch. We were in the on-site trailer talking to the project manager. He was going over some plans with us when a loud crash came from outside, and a bunch of yelling started. I looked out the window and saw several of the guys running towards something. Of course, I was curious. The 3 of us walked over to join the others. We were still unsure of what was going on until we got about 10 yards away. Slowly, the edges of a giant hole grew larger with every step. Not until I'd reached the very edge did I realize the full horror of what was unfolding. This huge hole was now much more. I'd heard of sinkholes, but never fully understood what they were until now. The very size of the thing had me in awe. An easy 30 yards across and at least 20 feet deep. The monstrosity had swallowed a full-size asphalt paver and its operator, with plenty of room to spare. And about that operator, I was afraid to ask who it was. They were nowhere to be seen, and surely hadn't survived. Almost as if the others could read my mind, David's name began to fill the air around me. Even before the emergency services arrived, we were yelling down into the dark chasm, hoping for some sign of life, no matter how small it may be. Our efforts were met by nothing but silence and the occasional crumbling sound of further collapse. There was nothing left for us to do but wait while rescue did their jobs. I'm not ashamed to say I had my fingers crossed up to the moment his body was lifted from the hole. I held a shred of hope. There was no way to avoid the truth now. My best friend and a very great man was gone. The detectives allowed me to be the only one to notify Ashley of his death. When I arrived at the apartment alone, she broke down immediately. My face surely betrayed my feelings to the entire world. Despite all my attempts at being stoic, seeing her tears burst the dam. We held each other and cried for several minutes until she eventually summoned the courage to hear my story. The repair of the sinkhole began the day after the funeral and took well over a week to complete. Returning to the site was difficult, and I could tell I wasn't the only one having a hard go of it. Time passed, and with it, work became easier. When the guys did begin talking again, most of what was said was about David. You really don't know how loved a person is until they die. At least, that's how I saw it. A day didn't pass where one of us didn't have a great story to recall to the others. It helped ease the sadness. I realized then just how lucky I was to call him a friend. In tragedy, something beautiful sometimes comes of it. What none of us knew at the time, including Ashley herself, was that she was pregnant. At first, all we could think of was how terrible it was that David wouldn't be around to see his child born. However, as I thought more about it, I realized this was truly a miracle. Had he passed a week sooner, his bloodline would have died with him. When the day arrived, I was lucky enough to be the first notified of the birth of little David Johnson Jr. My greatest hope now is to live long enough to see him grow into adulthood. If he becomes half the man his father was, the world would be better for having him. He has some pretty big shoes to fill, and something tells me he'll do just fine. Thank you for sharing my story, and remember to hold your loved ones close. Life is far too short. Until Frank took me under his wing, I'd never been good at anything. School was a long string of average grades and fleeting friendships. My sad attempt at becoming a football hero was just that sad. I'd hoped I could better myself by attending a nearby community college, only to bail out within 2 years. Somehow I was introduced to Frank, and things only improved. Frank was a well-known carpenter specializing in ornate carving and design. I was just a young 20-something with no real direction in life. My job was nothing more glamorous than cleaning up after a bunch of half-drunk builders around the worksite. Out of the blue, my boss came to me and said that I was being promoted. I was all excited, thinking I'd get a little cushy job like his assistant or something. Instead, I was told to report to Frank, actual name Franklin, and do what I was told. Story goes Frank got his nickname because his Texas accent was so thick everyone thought he was saying frankly instead of Franklin. He didn't seem to mind. He took it in stride, much like he did everything else in life. When I introduced myself to him, I just got a grunt in return. He handed me a work belt weighted down with some of the finest looking tools I'd ever seen and said, "These are yours now. You can pay me back whenever. Take care of them. I only give them to you once. You got any questions? Good." He cut me off before I could catch my breath. I was too intimidated to speak a word after that. For the rest of the day, I followed him around, soaking in every little morsel of information I could. That was how my apprenticeship began. Day after day, I watched Frank create some of the most amazing and beautiful works of art. It was almost a month before I was given my opportunity to actually touch a piece of wood. Looking back, it was an unsightly first attempt, but something in that grotesque image told Frank that he'd be able to make me into something resembling a craftsman. It also sparked a competitiveness inside me I'd never experienced before. I couldn't stand by while Frank created such wonderful things, while my work was nothing even nearing poor. Almost all my free time was spent practicing my new art, and this quickly began to bear fruit. I could see in Frank's face that he was pleased with my progress. In a few short years, my work became almost indistinguishable from his own. The day eventually arrived when it was my time to move on. Frank smiled at me like a proud father and wished me good luck. My next few years went well. I received several major commissions, the most notable the creation of a grand staircase in our mayor's family home. Speaking of family, soon after leaving Frank's tutelage, I met a beautiful girl and later married. It wasn't long until our son arrived, and everything appeared golden on the surface. What I didn't know then was my wife had continued her relationship with her ex-boyfriend, all the way up to the arrival of our son. This little fact would eventually cast doubt on who the boy's father actually was. Fortunately, later tests would prove it to be me. Even with the arrival of this great news, it did little to calm my mind. The collapse of my marriage weighed heavy on me, and I wasn't completely focused on my work. At the time, I was building a staircase in a mansion across town. Instead of putting all my talents towards my work, I was often elsewhere. My second to last morning at the site, I'd had an argument over the phone with my wife. We had agreed that I would be allowed to take my son for the night. However, she had changed her mind at the last minute. I did finally convince her, but the damage had been done. My mood had been ruined by her fickle power play. The only thing that would help would be seeing my son. I dry-fitted the last section of railing and ran out the door. The rest of that evening was spent playing video games and watching movies with him. I went to bed that night happier than I'd been in a long time. The next day, I dropped my son off at his mother's and went to complete my last bit of work. The house was pandemonium when I arrived. I was unable to get any reason as to why until I spoke to the grandmother of the family. She said the night before, her youngest grandson was playing with his older brother. At some point, he leaned against the landing railing, and it gave way. The boy was in serious condition, and at least presently, paralyzed from the neck down. Her every word stabbed deeper and deeper into me. She was well aware of who I was, and her frown told me all I needed to know about how she felt toward me. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just stared until she stomped off. I rushed to the spot I'd worked last, and just as I feared, a big hole sat in the railing. Open but unbroken, the remnants lay on the floor at my feet. Something didn't make sense. When I inspected the broken pieces, the true horror of what I'd done rushed into focus. I was unable to fight the sick feeling turning up in my stomach any longer. After retching for a minute or two, I looked again. It was still the same. No glue residue or nails or even screws. How in the world could I have made such a foolish error? A small glimmer of hope remained, though, as I ran up the stairs, purposefully grabbing at each length of railing, looking for any weaknesses. I hoped a sign or note would greet me somewhere nearby. Despite my fervent search, it wasn't to be. In a matter of a few quick moments, I'd ruined all I built, not to mention possibly crippled a young man for life. Looking back, I probably did everything wrong. In my defense, I was incredibly broken for my mistake. I was desperate to let the parents know this. They were less than pleased to see me when they did, although they had yet to realize just how negligent I'd been. My very image must have represented the thing that had caused their child's present condition. I left before the hospital security arrived to remove me. And even then, I knew it would be the last time I'd hear from these clients. In the short span of time it would take for the news to spread, I took as much work as possible. Jobs that should have taken days took far longer. My confidence had taken a big hit. The double, no triple checking of every move I made slowed me down, but I was determined I'd never make such a terrible mistake again. At least in the little time I had left. The day I dreaded finally came. Just 3 months later, the family's demand was an unbelievable $7.5 million, an amount not even someone as celebrated as Frank himself would ever be able to pay. Although my lawyer assured me the courts rarely awarded the initial amount, even $1 million would be enough to break me. If my insurance company did settle, I'd surely lose my coverage. It didn't matter. Work had dried up just as I'd feared it would from word of mouth. And then the years passed. It's been almost 13 years since that terrible day. With no new custom work coming in, I was forced to go back to regular residential carpentry. The drop in pay was hard to deal with at first, but I got by. My insurance company did just as I feared, and they managed to get the family to settle for $375,000. A paltry amount if you ask me. My policy was canceled the next day, and since then, I've kept my head down, working 6, sometimes 7 days a week. My divorce became final just a week after the settlement. I've swallowed a huge amount of my pride in the preceding years. I agreed to let my son stay with his mother despite my personal feelings in the matter. Maybe the differential behavior has been some form of unconscious penance for what I did, or didn't do, rather. Now that he's become his own man, I've been seeing more of my son as of late. He's shown some interest in Finnish carpentry, carving in particular. I was leery of taking him down that road at first, maybe because of my own unresolved feelings more than anything. He shows a natural aptitude for the trade that not even I had in the beginning. I wish Frank was still around to teach him. I've been away from that specialty for longer than I choose to admit. I fear he may not benefit the way he would have been taught by a more seasoned professional. Although I voiced this to him, he insists that I be the one who teaches him. I suppose I owe it to him in some way. That said, I intend on moving much slower with the boy than Frank did with me. Long before he's ever allowed to have his hand at a carving, there's one important aspect of the work that I wish I'd paid closer attention to. A man is never infallible, no matter his talents. He is open to lapses of thought. Focus and detail are the most important skills a Finnish carpenter must have. In a trade where your clients may use your work thousands of times in a lifetime, it is even more important to remember this. I put myself first before my client, and because of this, not one but 2 young men were robbed of a promising future. This was 2015, a much simpler and happier time. No one foresaw the god-awful mess ahead of us. I'd been working for myself 5 years, and my company was just beginning to make a real profit. My first son was on the way, and we were just months away from closing on our house. Life was the best it had ever been. That morning, a call came in for some repair work on a section of plumbing in a garage. The details were a tad sketchy, but the client was a retired widower. I wasn't expecting him to know the intricacies of his home's plumbing. After my apprentice and I finished our first job that morning, we had enough time before lunch to see what the exact problem was. The homeowner led us out to the garage and pointed out a big puddle on the floor. We poked around for a minute and found the source of the trouble, and it was a doozy. Not only was there a leaking utility sink next to the washer and dryer, which in itself is no major problem, the water had nowhere to go because the drain in the floor had a blockage. The 2 of us took an early lunch and returned to the home afterwards. I decided to tackle the drain problem first. It would require a lot of work. However, before we did any of this, we'd have to move the buttload of boxes filling the garage. Normally, I would have told the client to move their own stuff, but there was no way this old, frail man was going to be able to move all that stuff himself. According to him, his late brother had been a major collector of sports memorabilia from the 60s and 70s. After his death, Much of the collection had been sold. The remainder had been boxed up and moved out there by his nephew. A few hours of walking back and forth followed until we got to the last dozen boxes. All that remained was a small stack against the wall. I could see the end in sight and began moving them as fast as I was able. Only 2 remained, and I could finally start the real work. My apprentice grabbed the top box, so I took the last for myself. Without a second thought, I snatched it up and began to head for the door. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed some movement. When I looked back, I got the shock of my life. A small snake was coiled up on the garage floor, ready to strike. A horrifying realization set in. With a heavy heart, I slowly looked down to my arm and just above my left wrist saw 2 tiny spots of blood. I knew what it meant, but I was too scared to move. When my apprentice returned, he asked what was wrong. I didn't answer. I was doing everything I could not to panic about the bite. It unfortunately wasn't working. He looked down and noticed the snake. "Oh man, that's a copperhead." Without another word, he ran back into the house to return 20 seconds later. He had a shovel, which I can only guess came from the garage. I watched with disbelief as he jumped to one side and brought the blade down behind the snake's head. With the threat out of the way, he confidently looked back at me and said, "There we go. Now it can't bite anyone." I calmly looked at him and told him he was too late. The smug look slowly melted, and he led me out to the truck. I was still in so much shock I followed him obediently like a well-trained dog. During the course of the drive, he kept telling me to be calm, but I think he was more terrified than I was. We were fortunate enough to know the species of the snake, and this allowed the hospital to be able to start the antivenom process right away. By now, my arm was swelling, and the pain was considerable. You can probably guess I survived the bite. However, in some ways, I wish I hadn't. After several days and just as many shots, I received a bill of $115,000. Even after the insurance paid their part, I was neck deep in debt. When I was able to return to work, every cent we made went to the hospital. As a result, the company and our family's financial state had been teetering on the edge of bankruptcy ever since. I'm only thankful we managed to get out of the deal with the house. We would have been in foreclosure before the year was out. The company has been downsized to just the 3 of us. My wife handles the calls and appointments while myself and Chris, my loyal apprentice, do all we can to keep the ship afloat. Being deemed a necessary business, we've been allowed to continue working while so many have not. I feel terrible for those who haven't. At least half of them will never return once this mess has all ended, if it ever ends really. Even after all our hard work, we may join them in their fate. If you're religious, put in the good word for us. You may see it as a paltry act in view of how serious our situation is, but as I have discovered, the smallest of acts in the overall flow of things can make the biggest difference. Dr. Linda Patterson had worked in hospitals for 15 years before accepting a position at Memorial General, but she had never encountered anything like what awaited her on the cardiac intensive care unit. At 42, she considered herself a practical person, someone who relied on science and evidence rather than superstition or folklore. That worldview would be thoroughly tested during her first month on the night shift. "Welcome to the unit," said Dr. James Morrison, the attending physician who was showing her around during her orientation week. "We run a tight ship here, and our patient outcomes are among the best in the state. You'll find the night shift has its own rhythm and its own unique characteristics. Memorial General was a modern facility, opened just 10 years earlier to serve the growing metropolitan area of Phoenix, Arizona. Unlike older hospitals with their maze-like layouts and institutional atmosphere, this building was designed with healing in mind. Natural light flooded the corridors during the day, patient rooms were spacious and comfortable, and the latest medical technology was integrated seamlessly into every aspect of care. Any unusual aspects of working here I should know about? Linda asked as they walked through the cardiac unit, passing rooms where patients recovered from heart surgery and managed complex cardiac conditions. James paused, considering his words carefully while glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard by other staff members. Well, there are some stories that circulate among the night shift workers. Staff members occasionally report unusual experiences, particularly during the overnight hours. Nothing that interferes with patient care, mind you, but it's good to be prepared for the unexpected. Linda raised an eyebrow, her scientific mind immediately skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured or documented. What kind of unusual experiences? You'll see, James said, with a knowing smile that suggested he had his own stories to tell. Or maybe you won't. Not everyone is sensitive to these things, and some people work here for years without experiencing anything out of the ordinary. Linda's first few shifts passed without incident, allowing her to focus on learning the unit's protocols and building relationships with her new colleagues. The work was challenging but rewarding, caring for patients recovering from complex cardiac procedures and managing life-threatening emergencies. She enjoyed the quieter pace of nights, which allowed for more personalized patient care and deeper connections with families during difficult times. The cardiac unit specialized in post-operative care for patients who had undergone procedures ranging from routine angioplasty to complex open-heart surgery. Linda's role involved monitoring patients during the critical hours following their procedures, managing pain medications, watching for complications, and providing emotional support to families who were often terrified about their loved ones' conditions. It was during her second week that she had her first encounter with Memorial General's supernatural residents. Linda was making rounds at 2 a.m., checking on post-operative patients in the recovery bay, and ensuring that all monitoring equipment was functioning properly. The unit was quiet, except for the gentle beeping of heart monitors and the soft whoosh of ventilators, sounds that created a technological lullaby in the dimly lit corridors. She approached room 314, where Mr. Henderson was recovering from a triple bypass surgery. She noticed the privacy curtain rustling slightly, as if moved by air circulation from the ventilation system. Through the gap at the bottom of the curtain, she could see a pair of highly polished black dress shoes moving around the patient's bed. The shoes were attached to black socks and dark slacks, suggesting someone in formal attire rather than medical scrubs or family clothes. Linda paused, confused by the presence of an unauthorized visitor. Visiting hours had ended at 9 p.m., and no family members were scheduled to stay overnight with Mr. Henderson. Hospital security was strict about after-hours access, requiring special permission and identification for extended visits. "Excuse me," Linda called softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping patient, but needing to address the policy violation. "Sir, visiting hours are over. I'm going to need you to check with the nurses' station about extended visiting privileges." She pulled back the curtain to speak with the unauthorized visitor, expecting to find a family member who had simply lost track of time or misunderstood the visiting policies. Instead, she found only Mr. Henderson sleeping peacefully in his bed, surrounded by the normal array of cardiac monitoring equipment. The room was completely empty except for the patient and the medical devices keeping track of his vital signs. Linda stood there for several moments, staring at the space where she had clearly seen someone just seconds earlier. The shoes had been so distinct patent leather dress shoes that reflected the overhead lighting, not the kind of footwear typically worn by medical staff or family members visiting patients. "Is everything all right?" asked Monica Santos, the charge nurse, appearing in the doorway with the quiet efficiency that marked experienced night shift workers. "Did anyone check in to visit Mr. Henderson tonight?" Linda asked, still puzzled by what she had witnessed. "No, he doesn't have any family listed as overnight contacts," Monica replied. "His wife went home around 8, and no one else has asked about visiting him." "Why do you ask?" Linda hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid or unreliable during her second week on the job. "I thought I saw someone in the room, but there's nobody here now. Maybe I was more tired than I realized." Monica nodded knowingly, her expression suggesting that Linda's experience wasn't as unusual as it might seem. "Ah, you've met our chaplain, Father McKenna. He was hospital chaplain here when Memorial General first opened about 10 years ago. Died of a massive heart attack about 5 years ago while visiting a patient, but apparently he's still making his rounds." Linda felt a chill run down her spine as the implications of Monica's words sank in. "You're saying I saw a ghost. That's what most people believe," Monica said matter-of-factly, as if discussing supernatural encounters was a normal part of hospital orientation. Father McKenna was legendary for his dedication to patients. He would sit with dying patients for hours, making sure nobody passed away alone. The staff had been seeing him ever since his own death. Monica went on to explain that Father McKenna's appearances were considered a blessing rather than a curse by most staff members. Patients who received his visits often recovered more quickly than expected, and those who were dying seemed to pass more peacefully when he was present. So seeing him is actually a good sign. Linda asked, trying to reconcile her scientific worldview with the supernatural explanation she was being offered. "Usually, yes. Though some people say his presence indicates a patient is at a critical juncture, could go either way. Father McKenna seems to show up when people need spiritual comfort the most, whether they're aware of it or not." Over the following weeks, Linda had several more encounters with the spectral chaplain. She learned to recognize the sound of his distinctive footsteps, a measured, purposeful gait that suggested someone making important rounds. There was also a subtle shift in atmosphere that accompanied his presence, a sense of peace and comfort that seemed to settle over whatever room he was visiting. Unlike typical ghost stories that emphasized fear and supernatural terror, these encounters felt genuinely comforting rather than frightening. Linda began to appreciate the idea that Father McKenna's dedication to his calling had transcended death itself, allowing him to continue providing spiritual care to patients and families in their moments of greatest need. But Father McKenna wasn't the only supernatural resident of Memorial General, as Linda would soon discover. One particularly busy night, Linda was called to assist with a trauma patient in the emergency department. Dr. Richard Steinberg, a renowned cardiac surgeon who had died the previous year, had apparently not received the memo about his retirement from active practice. Linda was reviewing the patient's chart and preparing for emergency surgery when she became aware of someone standing behind her in the hallway. Turning around, she found herself face to face with a middle-aged man in surgical scrubs who radiated both competence and compassion. He had graying hair and intense blue eyes that seemed to see everything at once, the kind of focused intelligence that marked the very best medical professionals. Despite never having met him in life, Linda felt immediately that this was someone she could trust with the most difficult cases. "The patient needs immediate intervention," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of medical experience and the urgency of someone who had seen too many preventable deaths. "Aortic dissection, type A. Every minute we delay increases the mortality risk exponentially." Linda blinked, startled by the stranger's sudden appearance and his intimate knowledge of a case she had barely begun to review. "I'm sorry, who are you? Are you consulting on this case?" But when she looked again, focusing more carefully on the space where the man had been standing, she found only empty hallway. The area was bustling with the usual emergency department activity, nurses, technicians, and physicians moving with practiced efficiency, but no one matching the description of the man who had just spoken to her. "Did you see that doctor who was just here?" Linda asked a passing nurse, pointing to the spot where the apparition had been standing. "What doctor? It's just been you standing there for the past few minutes," the nurse replied, looking puzzled by the question. Confused but concerned about the patient's condition, Linda decided to follow the mysterious doctor's advice despite not understanding how he had acquired his information. She called for an immediate cardiac consultation, and further testing revealed exactly what the apparition had diagnosed: a life-threatening aortic dissection that required emergency surgery. The patient's life was saved by the early detection and rapid intervention, something that might not have happened without the ghostly guidance from someone who clearly understood cardiac emergencies better than most living physicians. Later, when Linda described the encounter to Dr. Morrison during their weekly check-in meeting, he showed her a memorial plaque in the hospital lobby. The photograph on the plaque matched the man she had seen perfectly: same graying hair, same intense blue eyes, same aura of medical competence. "Dr. Richard Steinberg," Dr. Morrison said with evident respect and admiration. "Best cardiac surgeon we ever had, and probably one of the best in the entire Southwest. He saved hundreds of lives over his 30-year career here. Apparently, death hasn't slowed him down much." Linda learned that Dr. Steinberg's spirit had been spotted numerous times since his death from pancreatic cancer, always in situations involving cardiac emergencies that required immediate expert intervention. His appearances seemed to guide medical staff toward correct diagnoses and life-saving treatments that might otherwise have been delayed or missed entirely. "Why do they stay?" Linda asked, genuinely curious about the phenomenon she was witnessing. "Both of them, I mean Father McKenna and Dr. Steinberg. Why haven't they moved on to whatever comes after death?" Dr. Morrison considered this question carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe they're not stuck here against their will. Maybe they choose to stay because this is where they found their greatest purpose in life. Some people are so dedicated to their calling that not even death can separate them from it." Linda found this perspective both touching and slightly unnerving. The idea that passion for healing could transcend mortality spoke to the deeper meaning of medical practice. But it also raised questions about the boundary between life and death that her scientific training hadn't prepared her to answer. But not all of the hospital's supernatural residents were benevolent healthcare providers dedicated to continuing their healing work, as Linda would discover during a particularly challenging shift. Several months into her tenure at Memorial General, Linda had an experience that shattered her growing comfort with the hospital's ghostly inhabitants and reminded her that not all spirits were motivated by love and compassion. She was working an exceptionally difficult shift when several cardiac patients had taken unexpected turns for the worse. The emotional and physical drain of losing patients, despite the medical team's best efforts, was taking its toll on the entire staff. The cardiac unit felt heavy with grief and frustration as families received devastating news and medical professionals questioned whether they could have done anything differently. Around 4 a.m., feeling overwhelmed by the night's losses and needing a brief respite from the intensity of the unit, Linda decided to take a short break and grab coffee from the cafeteria. The hospital corridors were nearly empty at that hour, with only essential staff moving quietly through the dimmed hallways. Linda waited for the elevator in the main lobby, grateful for a few minutes away from the heartbreak and medical emergencies that defined her work. When the elevator arrived, she was surprised to find it completely empty, unusual for a busy hospital, even during overnight hours when most departments operated with skeleton crews. She stepped inside and pressed the button for the cafeteria level, but immediately sensed that something was fundamentally wrong with the environment around her. The elevator felt oppressively cold, and the air seemed thick and difficult to breathe, as if the normal atmosphere had been replaced with something hostile and suffocating. As the elevator began to move, Linda was suddenly slammed against the back wall by an invisible force that felt like massive hands pressing against her chest and throat. The impact knocked the wind out of her lungs, and she found herself pinned there by what seemed like overwhelming physical pressure applied by something she couldn't see or understand. Terror flooded through her as she realized she couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly, couldn't cry out for help. The force holding her was malevolent and powerful, filled with a rage that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the elevator car itself. Images flashed through her mind, not her own memories, but visions that seemed to be projected by whatever was attacking her. She saw patients dying not from illness or surgical complications, but from deliberate harm inflicted by people who should have been protecting them. Medical procedures performed with cruel intent rather than healing purpose. The systematic abuse of power by those entrusted with the care of the vulnerable. The entity holding her prisoner was feeding on her fear, growing stronger as her panic increased. Linda realized that whatever this was, it was not a benevolent spirit like Father McKenna or Dr. Steinberg. This was something darker, something that thrived on suffering and death rather than seeking to prevent them. With tremendous effort and drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Linda managed to whisper a prayer her grandmother had taught her about protection from evil and guidance through dark times. The words seemed to create a protective barrier around her, weakening the entity's hold just enough for her to break free from its grasp. The elevator doors opened at that moment, and Linda stumbled out into the brightly lit cafeteria level, gasping for air and shaking from the encounter. Behind her, she could hear what sounded like furious screaming echoing from the elevator car. But when she turned around, the space was empty and silent. Linda never used that particular bank of elevators again during her time at Memorial General. We later learned from hospital security that there had been several unexplained incidents in those elevators over the years. Patients found unconscious, without medical explanation. Staff members discovered in states of severe distress, and at least one death that couldn't be attributed to any known medical cause. The experience taught Linda that hospitals, as places where intense emotions and life and death struggles played out on a daily basis, could attract various types of spiritual entities. Most were benevolent, like the chaplain and surgeon who continued their healing work from beyond the physical realm. but some were drawn to the pain and fear that also existed in medical settings, feeding on negative energy and seeking to cause harm rather than prevent it. Linda became more selective about which supernatural encounters she welcomed and which she actively avoided. She learned to distinguish between the protective presence of Father McKenna, the guiding expertise of Dr. Steinberg, and the malevolent force that lurked in certain areas of the hospital. Working alongside the dead became part of her daily routine at Memorial General, though she approached these relationships with greater wisdom and caution after her encounter with the hostile entity. She would nod respectfully when she sensed Father McKenna's presence during patient rounds, understanding that his spiritual guidance complemented her medical care. She paid careful attention when Dr. Steinberg's spirit seemed to be guiding her toward important medical insights that could save lives. The hospital had taught her that the boundary between life and death was more permeable than most people realized, and that dedication to healing could indeed transcend the physical world. Some spirits found peace in continuing their life's work, while others remained trapped by their own darkness and negative emotions. Linda's sensitivity to these presences made her a better doctor, more attuned to the spiritual as well as physical needs of her patients. She learned that healing involved more than just medical intervention. It required acknowledging the full spectrum of human experience, including those aspects that couldn't be measured with instruments or documented in medical charts. Memorial General continued to be a place where the living and the dead worked side by side, united in the common goal of preserving life and alleviating suffering. Linda was grateful to be part of that eternal mission, even when it meant sharing her workplace with colleagues who had moved beyond the physical realm. The experience had expanded her understanding of what it meant to be a healer, showing her that compassion and dedication could create bonds that transcended death itself. Whether dealing with living patients or spiritual presences, her role remained the same: to provide comfort, guidance, and protection to all souls in need of care. She never forgot the lessons learned during those supernatural encounters at Memorial General. That love could indeed conquer death. That dedication to healing was a calling that extended beyond physical existence, and that sometimes the most important medicine she could offer was simply acknowledging the presence and dignity of every soul she encountered, regardless of which side of the grave they called home. Nurse Jessica Coleman had been working in healthcare for 8 years when she joined the staff at Valley Regional Medical Center. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the supernatural activity that seemed to permeate every corner of the sprawling hospital complex. The modern facility, built on the site of a former tuberculosis sanatorium, had a reputation among staff for unexplained phenomena that went far beyond typical hospital folklore. "You'll get used to the call lights," explained her training supervisor, Karen Matsuda, as they walked through the medical surgical unit during Jessica's first week orientation. "They go off all the time, even in rooms that have been empty for days. It's just one of those things about working here." Jessica raised an eyebrow, her practical nature immediately questioning the explanation. "Equipment malfunction. That's what maintenance keeps saying when we submit work orders," Karen replied with a knowing smile that suggested she had her own theories about the phenomenon. "But the lights work perfectly fine when they test them. It's only during patient care hours that they seem to develop minds of their own." Valley Regional was a state-of-the-art facility serving a large rural area in Northern California. Built in the early 2000s to replace an older hospital, that had become outdated and inadequate for the community's growing needs. The hospital had been constructed on the same site as the previous facility, but construction workers had uncovered evidence of the tuberculosis sanatorium that had operated there from 1920 to 1965. During the excavation phase, workers had found remnants of the old foundation, medical equipment from the sanatorium era, and even unmarked graves containing the remains of patients who had died far from their families. The discovery had delayed construction for months, while archaeologists and historians documented the site and ensured that the remains were treated with proper respect. During Jessica's first week, she experienced the phantom call lights firsthand while working the evening shift on the cardiac telemetry unit. She was updating patient charts when room 412's call light began flashing insistently on the central monitoring board. "That room's been empty since yesterday morning," noted her colleague, Marcus Rivera, looking up from his medication administration records. Patient was discharged home around 10 a.m. Housekeeping cleaned it this afternoon, and no one's been admitted to that bed yet. Jessica went to investigate anyway, following protocol despite the apparent equipment glitch. Hospital policy required staff to respond to every call light activation, regardless of the circumstances, to ensure that no legitimate emergency was ever ignored. The room was indeed empty, stripped of linens, and cleaned for the next admission. The bed was positioned in the standard configuration, medical equipment was properly stored, and there were no signs that anyone had been in the room since the housekeeping staff finished their work. She turned off the call light and returned to the nurse's station. 5 minutes later, the same light was flashing again, accompanied by the soft chime that indicated a patient was requesting assistance. "I'll check it this time," Marcus offered, but Jessica was already walking back toward the room, curious about what might be causing the malfunction. This time, when she entered the empty room, Jessica felt an overwhelming sense of sadness that hit her like a physical wave. The emotion was so intense and unexpected that she had to steady herself against the doorframe, struggling to understand where such profound grief was coming from. It wasn't her own sadness. The feeling seemed external, as if the room itself was mourning something or someone. The sensation was accompanied by a bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning system. She quickly turned off the light again and left the room, but the feeling of profound loss lingered in her mind for the rest of the shift, making it difficult to concentrate on her other duties. "Room 412 seems to be particularly active," Karen mentioned during their next meeting, when Jessica reported the repeated call light incidents. "We've had several reports about that room over the years. Patients often say they feel like they're not alone, even when no visitors are present." Jessica learned that the hospital's supernatural activity wasn't limited to malfunctioning call lights. Staff members throughout the facility reported similar experiences: elevators that operated on their own, footsteps in empty corridors, equipment that turned on and off without explanation, and the persistent sensation of being watched by invisible presences. But it was during her second month at Valley Regional that Jessica encountered the hospital's most disturbing phenomenon, an experience that would change her understanding of the boundary between life and death. She was working a particularly busy night shift when several emergency admissions had filled the unit to capacity. Around 3 a.m., she needed supplies from the storage room at the end of the medical surgical wing, a room that was typically kept locked and was rarely visited during night hours, except when inventory was running low. as Jessica unlocked the storage room door with her master key. She was immediately struck by how cold the space felt compared to the rest of the unit. Her breath began to fog slightly as she searched for the supplies she needed, and the temperature difference was so pronounced that she wondered if there was a problem with the heating system. The storage room was larger than most, designed to hold equipment and medical supplies for the entire floor. Tall metal shelving units created narrow aisles that disappeared into shadows beyond the reach of the overhead lighting, giving the space a maze-like quality that felt somehow oppressive. Jessica was gathering IV supplies and wound care materials when she heard what sounded like someone sitting up on a hospital bed. The unmistakable creak of a bed frame and the rustle of sheets came from somewhere deep in the storage room, beyond the shelving units where she couldn't see. "Hello," she called out, thinking perhaps another staff member was taking an unauthorized break in the quiet space, or maybe a confused patient had wandered away from their room. "Is someone in here?" The sound stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Jessica grabbed what she needed and quickly left the room, making sure to lock it securely behind her. The next night, she was again working late when the need for supplies drew her back to the storage room. This time, she was prepared for the cold temperature, but nothing could have prepared her for what she heard when she entered the space. As soon as she stepped through the doorway, voices began calling out, not just one voice, but multiple people calling for help. The voices were faint but distinct, men and women of various ages pleading for assistance in tones that ranged from weak whispers to urgent cries. "Help me," came one weak voice from the left side of the room. "Please, someone help," echoed another from the opposite direction. "I can't breathe," gasped a third voice, filled with the desperation of someone struggling for air. "It hurts so much," whispered a fourth, the words barely audible but filled with unbearable suffering. Jessica stood frozen in the doorway, surrounded by the sounds of anguish that seemed to come from every direction, but had no visible source. The voices overlapped and faded, creating a chorus of need and pain that made her heart race with sympathetic panic. She grabbed the nearest supplies and fled the room, her hands shaking as she locked the door behind her. Back at the nurse's station, she tried to calm herself and make sense of what she had experienced. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Marcus observed when he saw her pale complexion and trembling hands. "Something like that," Jessica managed, not sure how to explain what had happened without sounding like she was having a mental breakdown. Marcus nodded grimly, recognizing the signs of someone who had encountered Valley Regional's supernatural residents. "Yeah, several people have reported strange experiences in that storage area. That's where they found the old morgue when they were renovating the building." Jessica felt her blood run cold as the implications hit her. Morgue, from the tuberculosis sanatorium that used to be here. Hundreds of people died in that building over the decades, and that room was apparently where they prepared the bodies before burial. Some people think the voices you hear are patients who died calling for help that never came. The revelation put Jessica's experiences into a heartbreaking context, but it didn't make them any less disturbing. She began to understand that Valley Regional wasn't just dealing with typical hospital spirits. It was built on ground that had witnessed decades of suffering and death from a disease that had been poorly understood and often inadequately treated. Over the following weeks, Jessica learned more about the hospital's supernatural residents and developed a better understanding of their needs and motivations. The phantom call lights weren't random equipment failures. They were attempts by deceased patients to summon help, just as they had done in life when illness left them weak and dependent on others for care. During one particularly active night, Jessica counted over 20 false alarms from empty rooms across 3 different units. Each time she responded to a call light, she felt the presence of someone in desperate need of care and attention, someone who remembered being sick and requiring assistance, but no longer understood that death had freed them from physical suffering. "They're still trying to get help," she explained to a new nurse who was growing frustrated with the constant interruptions to their workflow. "Even in death, they remember being patients who needed medical care, and they're still reaching out for the comfort and attention they received when they were alive." Jessica's sensitivity to spiritual presences made her uniquely qualified to work at Valley Regional, but it also placed an emotional burden on her that was difficult to bear. She felt responsible not just for her living patients, but for the dozens of spirits who continued to seek comfort and care from beyond the grave. Most disturbing encounters occurred in the hospital's older wing, where the original foundation of the tuberculosis sanatorium was still visible in the basement levels. Jessica was rarely required to work in that area, but occasional supply runs took her through corridors that felt heavy with residual suffering and accumulated grief. It was during one such trip that she encountered the hospital's most tragic spirit, an experience that would haunt her for years to come. Jessica was retrieving archived patient files from the basement records room when she heard footsteps following her through the narrow corridor. The footsteps were light and quick, like those of a child, but when she turned around to see who was behind her, the hallway was empty. "Hello," she called out softly, not wanting to startle whoever might be there. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped, but Jessica could sense a presence nearby, young, frightened, and desperately seeking help from someone who might understand their situation. As she continued toward the records room, the footsteps resumed, now accompanied by what sounded like labored breathing. The sound was heartbreaking, clearly a child struggling with respiratory illness, probably tuberculosis, trying to keep up with an adult who might represent their only hope for comfort. Jessica's heart broke as she realized she was hearing the spirit of a young patient who had died alone and afraid, far from family and home. The tuberculosis sanatorium had treated children as well as adults, and many young patients had spent their final days in institutional isolation rather than surrounded by loved ones. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly, speaking to the empty air, but hoping her words would provide some comfort. "You're safe now. The sickness can't hurt you anymore, and you don't have to be afraid." The breathing sounds gradually faded, replaced by a sense of peace that seemed to settle over the corridor like a gentle blanket. Jessica felt that her acknowledgement and compassion had provided some measure of comfort to a spirit who had been waiting decades for someone to notice their pain. She later learned from hospital records that the tuberculosis sanatorium had indeed treated hundreds of children, many of whom had died far from their families during an era when quarantine policies separated sick children from their loved ones for months or years. The child's spirit she had encountered was probably one of dozens of young souls who had never received proper comfort during their final days. Her experiences at Valley Regional taught Jessica that hospitals could serve as bridges between the world of the living and the dead, places where the intense emotions generated by illness, healing, and loss created conditions that allowed spirits to linger and sometimes communicate with the living. Rather than being frightened by these encounters, Jessica began to see them as an extension of her nursing duties. She learned to acknowledge the presence of spiritual patients with the same compassion she showed to living ones, understanding that the need for care and comfort didn't end with physical death. When call lights flashed in empty rooms, she would respond with a gentle word of acknowledgement and comfort. When she sensed the presence of suffering spirits, she offered verbal reassurance and recognition of their pain. Gradually, the phantom calls became less frequent as the spirits realized they were being heard and acknowledged by someone who truly cared. "You have a gift," Karen told her during a performance review several months later. "Patient satisfaction scores for this unit have improved significantly since you started working here. Even families mention feeling more comfortable, like their loved ones are being watched over by someone who truly understands what they're going through." Jessica realized that her sensitivity to spiritual presences had made her more attuned to the emotional needs of all her patients, living and dead. The hospital had taught her that healing involved more than medical treatment. It required recognizing the full spectrum of human experience and responding with empathy and compassion that transcended the physical realm. Valley Regional continued to be a place where past and present intersected, where the spirits of former patients sought the care and comfort they had been denied in life. Jessica was honored to serve as a bridge between worlds, offering healing to souls who had been waiting decades for someone to finally hear their cries for help. The hospital's reputation for supernatural activity no longer seemed ominous to her. Instead, it represented the enduring power of the human spirit to seek connection and care, even beyond the boundaries of life and death. Every phantom call light and ghostly encounter was a reminder that the need for compassion and healing never truly ends. It simply takes different forms as souls transition from one state of existence to another. Working at Valley Regional had transformed Jessica's understanding of both nursing and spirituality. She had learned that some patients never truly leave the hospital, and that the most important medicine she could offer was simply the acknowledgement that their suffering mattered and their presence was recognized. The spirits of the tuberculosis sanatorium had taught her that death didn't end the human need for dignity, respect, and care. It had shown her that true healing involved seeing beyond the physical body to the eternal spirit that existed within every person, and that the bonds between caregiver and patient could transcend even death itself. In the end, the ghosts of Valley Regional weren't harbingers of fear or doom. They were teachers and patients, showing her that the most profound healing happened when she acknowledged the full humanity of every soul she encountered, regardless of whether they drew breath or existed in memory and spirit. Jessica continued her work at Valley Regional with a deeper appreciation for the sacred nature of healthcare, understanding that every patient, living or dead, deserved to be seen, heard, and treated with the compassion that could transform suffering into peace and fear into comfort. The hospital had become more than just a place of medical treatment. It was a sanctuary where all souls could find the care and recognition they needed to heal, whether that healing took place in life or in the eternal realm beyond physical existence. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.